In this video, we're going to spend a little bit of time learning about the three layout controls that are available in Silverlight to position controls on our phone's user interface. If you're familiar with web development using HTML, some of the same issues exist with laying out and positioning text and controls in Silverlight as well. The XAML designer that we've been working with makes it easy to absolutely position controls into a specific spot and anchor them there. But web developers dislike using CSS to absolutely position text and controls because of the number of different web browsers, as well as all the different screen resolutions, browser widths and heights, and so on, which make creating a safe, consistent experience for the end user very challenging. In Silverlight, especially when building phone applications, the developer has a little more confidence that the absolute positioning will work because, after all, there's only one available screen size for the Windows Phone 7, at least at launch. However, a second Windows Phone 7 screen size, a little bit smaller than the original, will eventually become available. So we have to take that into account. Additionally, you have to consider what happens when your application is rotated by the user from a portrait to a landscape. How will that affect the absolutely positioned controls that might be off and no longer visible because of the new position of the phone? So it's generally a good idea to not absolutely position your containers and controls using the XAML designer. Instead, you should generally rely on the strengths of the containers to position the controls, as we'll demonstrate in this lesson. So there are three controls that are used for layout: the grid, the canvas, and the stack panel. So let's start with talking about what they all share in common, and then we'll come back and look at their strengths and weaknesses a little bit later in this lesson. So as you can see, in Visual Studio, I have open a project called Layout Controls. And what I want to do is just pick one of the containers to work with as a way of talking generally about what they all share in common. So I'm going to drag and drop a canvas control into our main area. And when we start off, let's talk about what we mean by the main area. As you can see, when I position in this large area underneath the title and the page name, we get a canvas inside of the content panel. The content panel is a grid that hasn't defined any rows or columns, therefore it only has one row and column. And so our canvas control is positioned relative to this single column and row inside of our content panel grid. And you can see that it's positioned relative to it through the use of these arrows that are docked to the left and to the top. So when we look at the margin for the canvas, it has a 108 pixel margin from the left and an 86 pixel margin from the top. And when we move our margin around, those numbers will increase now since we moved it lower and to the right hand side. Now it's 188 and 156. We can change the relative position of how the margin should be interpreted by clicking on those arrows. Now it's understood that by clicking on those arrows, we're changing the horizontal alignment and the vertical alignment, and also our margins now will be relative to 68 from the right and 351 from the bottom. Okay. So if we wanted to center our control right in the middle of the content panel, what we can do is go to the Properties panel and change the vertical alignment from bottom to stretch, and change the horizontal alignment from right to stretch. And now when we position our control, it's relative to all four sides. The next thing I'm going to do is remove all the margins and see what happens. So when I click the down arrow for margin, notice that it gives me this little designer. Margins are represented with a series of four numbers separated by commas. And those four numbers represent, as we can clearly see here, the left side, the top, the right hand side, and the bottom. So if we were to zero all these values out, going to use the tab key on my keyboard, it positions our canvas right smack dab in the center of our content panel grid. So the key idea is that by modifying the margin, the vertical alignment, the horizontal alignment, as well as the width and the height, you can achieve the designer position for just about any container or control within its parent container. But again, we're doing it with an absolutely positioned mindset. That might not be the right way to go about it for every application. So let's talk about the other controls and what they can help us do to alleviate that issue. I want to get more specific about the grid first, and then we'll move on to the stack panel and back to the canvas. For now, I'm going to delete the canvas by selecting it and hitting the delete key on my keyboard, and now I want to drag and drop a grid onto the designer surface, and I'll go ahead and make it nice and big so that we can see it easily here. So we have a new grid inside of our content panel grid, and as we saw in one of the previous videos, the intent of the grid is to add a number of rows and columns and then position our controls inside of each of the cells that are created by the definition of those rows and columns. So what I'm going to do is, there's a number of different ways to define rows and columns. I'm going to do it first of all just using XAML. So you can see here I'm going to close out the grid tag and allow us to add some additional XAML syntax between the beginning grid tag and the ending grid tag. And I happen to already have some written, and I'm just going to copy it and paste it so I don't have to type all this out. Okay, so as you can see here, I have 2 rows defined and 2 columns defined. The rows will be at least 80 pixels wide, or tall rather, and there will be 2 columns that are each at least 100 pixels wide. You can see that in the case of this second row definition that I used a star or an asterisk after it, which means that it should be given any additional, or at least it should be given its fair share of any additional height that's available. In this case, you can see that we are looking at an 80 pixel row and then an 80 pixel row plus whatever else is available. In this case, quite a bit of height is been assigned to it. We can even that out by putting an asterisk inside of both row definitions. Now they equally share any extra height that's available. Same is true with the column definition. The first column is defined with a asterisk, which means give me any additional space that you can spare, or at least give me my share of it. The second column is defined strictly as 100, so it will get exactly 100 pixels. Now, also take a look at the designer surface itself. If I were to hover my mouse cursor over it, notice that, well, first of all, notice that it has a 100 in this column, and it has a 100 star in this column, which is indicative of this right here, the widths that we've already defined. Same is true with the rows, 80 star and 80 star as we've defined here. As I hover my mouse cursor over that little box, you can see that I get a little description of the values. So this indicates that it's fixed. The star indicates that the column is sized with a weighted proportion, and then there's another value that we don't have, which is auto, which means the width or the height of the column or row will be dictated by the controls that are inside of it. Okay. So if I were to hover over this one, you can see that it has a star, an asterisk, even though it also has a fixed value associated with it. So we created rows and columns using XAML, which is probably the preferred way because now we understand how this all works. But there's another quick way to, or actually a couple of other quick ways to build rows and columns, define them within our grid. The first is just to kind of hover our mouse cursor along this top area here, and you notice when I do that I'm seeing an arrow with a line come down, and I can just click here to create a new column, and I can click here to create a new row definition. Pretty neat. If I want to get rid of this, all I need to do is select it and then drag away, and you can see there's a little X, a red X cursor, which means we're going to delete that definition. So let's go ahead and remove the ones that we just added. We can also create rows and columns by right-clicking in the grid itself and then selecting grid row or grid column. And you can see here we can insert before or insert after. We can also use the contextual menu to move row definitions up and down within the grid or left and right using move before and move after. Finally, with the grid selected, I can go to the properties window and select the column definition or the row definitions to bring up the collection editor. Here I can add additional rows and set some properties of them, such as their minimum height and their regular height and their max height and things of that nature. And that will create the same syntax that we see in here. It'll just some different phrasing that'll accomplish the same thing essentially. Okay, so that is all the ways that we can then create row and column definitions. How do we use these? Well, within the body of the grid, what I can do is type in, for example, a button. We can give it a width equals 100 and a height equals 100 and a content equals high. And what I'll also do then is give it a grid dot row equals 1 and a grid dot column equals 0. And these are called attached properties. The button control does not have a grid.row property or a grid.column property usually. It only gets that property when it sits inside of a grid. Attached properties, something new inside of XAML that's not available to XML and HTML, one of those unique properties that I told you about in the previous lesson. So if I were to close off this button, now we'll see it. This button sits in row 1. And again, this is 0 based, so this is row 0 and this is row 1. It also sits in column 0, which is this is column 0 and this would be column 1 and so on. So that's how we're able to then assign one of our controls into a row and a column. Notice by default that it is set with its alignments to stretch and there's no margins set. Alright, so that wraps up what I wanted to say about the grid. Let's move on and talk about the stack panel. To work with the stack panel, I don't want to delete any of the work that I've done here, so I want to add a new XAML page. We haven't done this yet, at least I don't believe we have. So I'm going to go up to our Add New Item button on our toolbar, and I'm going to click the little down arrow, and I'm going to select Add New Item. I could also just click it, but it gives me some additional options if I click the down arrow. And here I want to make sure to select a Windows Phone portrait page. And then I'm going to name this Stack Panel Page.xaml and click the Add button. The stack panel is pretty simple. All the controls that are contained within a stack panel are displayed in a vertical stack. So I can either drag and drop a stack panel onto the designer, or I can type one in by hand. For now, I'll just go ahead and drag and drop a stack panel and position it. But then once I see it here in my designer, or in my code editor rather, I'm going to go ahead and start typing and adding some text blocks. And after I get bored typing the first one, I'm just going to copy and paste from some code I've already created. And notice I have 4 text blocks. Haven't set a bunch of properties on them, just the text. But notice how they're arrayed within the stack panel in a vertical fashion. And it's really as simple as that. The text block controls simply rendered vertically, stacked on top of each other. Notice that the order that they're added to the stack panel is the order in which they're displayed from top to bottom. For simple input screens, this would be a simple way to arrange the controls. The good thing about it is that if you were to change from a portrait to a landscape view in your phone, this will at least arrange itself pretty orderly with consistent results. All right, moving on, let's create another new page so we don't destroy this work. I'm going to create another Windows Phone portrait page. I'm going to call this one Canvas page and click Add. And I'll drag and drop a canvas once again as we did at the beginning. And I'm going to position it in the upper left hand corner. I'll resize it a little bit. Alright, so let's suppose that you really need to position some controls in very specific places on screen. This is what the canvas is for. Instead of using margins to define the position of controls inside of a canvas, using attached properties, the controls define the left and top properties relative to the upper left-hand corner of the canvas itself. So you typically don't use a canvas to fill the entire content grid. You could, but rather you use a single cell of the grid, if ever, and then you position the canvas inside of that. The canvas might seem like the path of least resistance, and therefore you would think, hey, it's preferred. However, it might produce unpredictable results if the dimensions of the Windows Phone 7 change, or if the phone is used in landscape or portrait mode as opposed to strictly a portrait mode as we've been doing up to this point. So let's go back to the toolbox, and what I want to do is drag two text block controls inside of the canvas itself. Actually, I'll have to drag outside, and then I'll drag them inside of the text block, the canvas control rather. So here again, I'll wait till the toolbox disappears. I might have to even drop it to get it to disappear. And now I'll position inside of our canvas control. So notice the two text block controls that we've added. They now have a left and a top property. Notice that the left is 26 and the top is 23 for our first one, and the left is 170 and 171 for the second one. Now what I'll do is reposition the canvas itself using its little handle in the upper left hand corner, and as I move the canvas, all the items inside the canvas move along with it. However, the left and top of both of our text blocks stay in the same position, and that's really the purpose of the canvas control, so that even if the canvas moves, the controls inside of it will remain relative to the upper left hand corner of the canvas itself. Alright, so finally, let me just say this. While every application that you build will probably be a little bit different, I imagine that for simple phone applications you'll probably do this. You're going to add one or more rows into the content grid, and perhaps even create columns as well. Then you're going to add a single input control like a text block or a text box or a button, and then assign its row and column within its parent appropriately. If you need to put two controls into the same cell, then you would use a stack panel in the cell and then place the input controls inside of the stack panel. Only on rare occasions would you ever find yourself using the canvas control. Just be sure if you do use it that you know what you're doing, and be sure that you test it to work in both the portrait and landscape, and that when or if the day ever comes where there's a different sized phone interface for your application, that you test that as soon as possible as well. Okay, so now that we have more information about laying out controls, using the layout controls, the grid, the canvas, and the stack panel, let's take a look at the other input controls that we've been ignoring up to now. Let's learn about what the other controls do in our toolbox, and we'll start that in the next video. Thank you.